Welcome to the debate. When most of us think about, preparing for a disaster, we picture buying extra canned goods or maybe a portable generator.
Right, something practical.
Exactly. It's grounded in basic survival. But imagine swapping out that basement full of bottled water for a clandestine, ultra-luxurious underground resort in the desert.
Yeah, it's a very different scale.
And instead of worrying about the shelf life of batteries, you're sitting around calculating the exact disciplinary mechanisms required to stop your armed guards from turning on you when fiat currency finally collapses.
I mean, it sounds like a dystopian screenplay, but it is a very real boardroom consultation.
It is. So here on Cognitive Dose, our core mission is curing blind spots and shattering cognitive bias through rigorous intellectual exchange. And today, we are undertaking a deep investigation into Douglas Rushkoff's Ruskoff, highly publicized text, Survival of the Richest, Escape Fantasies of the Tech Billionaires.
And we are going to look far beyond the surface level appeal of this book. We really need to dig into the underlying data.
Absolutely. To set the framework for today's discussion, I'll be taking the position that this book is a vital, whistleblowing text. It provides unparalleled first-hand insight into the apocalyptic preparations of the tech elite.
Okay.
By diagnosing the pathological worldview that drives these billionaires, the book gives the public a crucial lens, really, to understand how the ultra-wealthy are consciously designing technology to just insulate themselves from the rest of humanity. It exposes a profound moral rot that we need to see to combat.
And I will be taking the opposing position today. My deep dive into the critical literature and the research dossier we'll be pulling from reveals a much more troubling dynamic.
Well, let's hear it.
I argue that this book, despite its veneer of radical critique, actually functions as a dangerous misdirection. It acts as a pacifying form of escape therapy that psychologizes the elite, absolves them of their predatory actions, and, frankly, entirely misses the immediate material threats they pose to the democratic social contract.
We definitely have clear battle lines then. Let's start with the foundational anecdote of the text, because everything really flows from this specific encounter.
Right, the desert trip.
Yeah, the desert trip. So Rushkoff, Ruskoff, who is a media theorist and professor, is offered a consulting fee roughly equivalent to a third of his annual academic salary.
Which is a massive red flag right off the bat.
Oh, absolutely. He flies out to this remote desert resort, fully expecting to deliver a standard keynote address to investment bankers about the future of digital economics, blockchain, Web3, the usual tech landscape.
He assumes he's just there to provide market foresight.
Right. But there is no stage, there is no audience of bankers. Instead, he's brought into a private green room and seated before just 5 unnamed ultra-wealthy men.
And 2 of them are verified billionaires, right?
Exactly, and they have zero interest in his prepared lecture on digital economics. They are entirely obsessed with what they euphemistically call the event.
The event. It's so ominous.
It is. This is their catch-all term for total societal collapse, whether that's environmental disintegration, a nuclear exchange, or like a malicious global computer hack.
And the nature of their questioning is what's so revealing here. They aren't asking how to prevent the event. They just treat it as an absolute inevitability.
That is the chilling part. Their fears are hyper-specific and purely logistical. One CEO had nearly completed his underground bunker system, and his most pressing question was literally, how do I maintain authority over my security force after the event?
Wow.
They were completely serious. They debated the merits of using special combination locks on the food supply that only the billionaire knew, or even forcing their security personnel to wear disciplinary collars to ensure loyalty when money no longer had value.
I mean, the profound disconnect from humanity there is just staggering.
It really is. And Rushkoff tries to reason with them. He suggests that the best way to ensure loyalty in a post-collapse future is to treat those guards well right now, to engage in partnership and solidarity.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, he cheekily advises one of the billionaires to pay for his head of security's daughter's bat mitzvah today, just to build genuine human connection. But the billionaires just laugh at him.
Of course they do.
And from this specific encounter, the book extrapolates its central diagnosis of Silicon Valley, which it calls the mindset.
Let's unpack that term,
because the mindset is really the philosophical engine of the whole book.
Right, so the mindset is the pathological drive to use technology not to elevate society, but as the ultimate exit strategy. The goal of hypercapitalism under the mindset is simply to earn enough wealth to insulate oneself from the apocalyptic damage caused by extracting that very wealth in the first place.
It's a vicious cycle.
It's like trying to build a car that goes fast enough to outrun its own toxic exhaust. The author argues they are trapped in a cognitive loop where human connection is a liability and technological isolation is the only victory condition.
That metaphor of outrunning the exhaust is incredibly evocative, I'll give it that. I acknowledge that the premise captures the ambient civilizational anxiety of our era perfectly.
It resonates with a lot of people.
It does, but that metaphor is exactly where my fundamental issue with this text begins. When you bring in the research dossier and analyze the structural reality of global wealth, framing this as a psychological affliction creates a massive, dangerous moral loophole.
A moral loophole? How so? I mean, the book is highly critical of their behavior. It paints them as absurd and detached.
It does, but it simultaneously frames these tech billionaires as tragic victims or losers who are trapped within this cognitive loop of their own design.
Well, they kind of are, aren't they?
It essentially suggests they are just frightened boys held hostage by an abstract ideology, the mindset. When you cross the line from structural observation into psychologizing class warfare, you grant moral absolution.
I'm not sure I agree it's absolution.
Well, if these men, who are hoarding historic concentrations of global capital and actively degrading the biosphere, are just victims of a bad mindset, we effectively shift the culpability away from their conscious, predatory material actions.
I see why you might draw that conclusion from the dossier, but I have to push back strongly there. Humanizing them doesn't absolve them. I'd argue it actually highlights the sheer absurdity of their power.
But doesn't it soften the blow?
No. Isn't it actually quite useful for the public to see them not as invincible, hyper-rational masterminds, but as paranoid victims of their own perversely limited rules? It strips away the mythology of the infallible tech genius. It shows that their conscious choices are driven by fear, which is a powerful indictment, not an excuse.
I understand the rhetorical value of stripping away their mythology. But look at the consequences of that psychological framing. Angle 1 of our research dossier highlights a profound mismatch in scale when it comes to the solutions the book offers.
You mean the localized solutions?
Yes, because the text diagnoses a psychological problem. It prescribes a psychological and localized cure. It suggests we practice personal mindfulness, engage in local mutual aid, and literally advises readers to make nice with the butler.
Okay, but building community resilience is important.
Sure, but the author even publicly discourages political mobilization, dismissing voting as an intentional opiate for the masses.
The dismissal of voting is certainly controversial, I'll give you that, but promoting localized community resilience, like mutual aid, is a very standard response to systemic fragility.
But the threat isn't just systemic fragility. It is state-dwarfing capital backed by autonomous drone technology and militarized private security. Relying on localized community gardens and hugging your neighbor in the face of that is, frankly, anthropologically naive.
And that seems a bit harsh.
Collapse theorists note that human communities facing acute resource starvation are highly susceptible to violent factionalism, advising the global majority to rely on the goodness of neighbors while explicitly telling them to abandon political resistance and voting is a demobilization of the public.
So you see it as a surrender?
It's the definition of a remediation failure. It leaves the material violence of the bunker class completely unchallenged.
I think you're misinterpreting the goal of localized solutions. It's not about physically fighting a drone with a community garden. It's about rejecting the isolationist premise of the mindset entirely. But let's follow your critique of his methodology. Because Rushkoff, Ruschkoff, actually grounds this psychological detachment in the history of science.
Oh yes, the Dawkins encounter.
Right. He argues that this entire trajectory of isolation is born from a specific flavor of Western empirical science. He recounts a dinner party encounter with evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins to illustrate this.
And how does he frame Dawkins there?
He portrays Dawkins, and by extension empirical science, as inherently reductive, breaking complex systems down into isolated dead parts for extraction, while completely ignoring the holistic beauty of human connection. The text argues that this cold, quantitative empiricism is the direct philosophical ancestor of Silicon Valley's sociopathic behavior today.
And according to our dossier, that is a cartoonish caricature of empirical science. The critical literature is very clear on this. The book operates more like a breathless, conceptually thin TED Talk than a piece of rigorous theory.
That's quite a claim.
It falsely claims that quantitative empiricism is purely reductionist. In stark reality, modern empirical science has been deeply invested in systemic interconnectedness for decades. The text deliberately ignores advanced holistic fields like systems biology, cybernetics, and macroecology.
Just for our audience, could you clarify what you mean by those fields in this context?
Absolutely. Take macroecology or cybernetics. These disciplines use sophisticated, quantitative mathematical models precisely to map out the fragile ecological and social webs that the author claims science ignores.
Okay, so science is already doing the holistic work he says it isn't.
Exactly. Science isn't just dissecting dead frogs, it's analyzing how a change in ocean temperature impacts global supply chains and human migration. By painting science as the enemy of human connection, the author creates a false binary that weakens his own argument.
I grant that it's a simplification of the scientific method, but we have to remember the medium here. He isn't writing a peer-reviewed sociological journal. He's translating elite behavior for a mass audience.
But that lack of rigor bleeds into his own methodology. Think about the unprecedented access he had. He was invited into the absolute inner sanctums of the global tech elite. A rigorous researcher would deploy standardized qualitative methodologies like grounded theory or ethnographic coding.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with those academic processes, what does that actually look like in practice?
Well, instead of just collecting wild stories, grounded theory requires a researcher to meticulously transcribe interviews, code them for recurring linguistic themes, and systematically build a verifiable framework of how these people think.
And you feel the book lacks that?
Entirely. We don't get that. We get unverified, one-dimensional anecdotes and snappy sound bites. It's a massive conceptual overgeneralization. And when you substitute rigorous sociological mapping for individual diagnoses, you end up prescribing individual therapy instead of structural reform.
I simply don't agree that ethnographic coding would have made this a better or more impactful book. The power of the text is the one-dimensional anecdote, because the billionaires themselves are operating in a one-dimensional way.
You really think so?
I do. The fact that a billionaire is seriously asking about disciplinary collars isn't something you need to code for linguistic themes to understand. The horror is right there on the surface. The anecdotes serve as a mirror to their absurdity.
But it's a distorted mirror because it relies on a flawed historical timeline, which brings us to the third angle in our dossier, the most dangerous misdirection in the text.
You're talking about the cyber nostalgia.
Yes, the book relies heavily on a kind of naive cyber nostalgia.
It does look back fondly on the early days of the internet, the Mondo 2000 era, the early cyberpunks.
Exactly.
The book paints that period as a radically inclusive, egalitarian utopia that was only tragically corrupted later by corporate interests, right around the AOL-Time Warner merger in the year 2000.
And then it uses that nostalgia as a weapon.
Right, from that nostalgia, it mocks the current tech elite for abandoning that pure digital playground in favor of absurd future escape plans, like uploading their consciousness to the cloud or building self-sustaining Martian colonies.
And my research thoroughly dismantles that nostalgic narrative. The early internet was never a pure egalitarian utopia. Media theorists and historians have long documented that the foundational DNA of Silicon Valley was what is known as the Californian ideology.
Walk me through the mechanics of that ideology, because when most people think of the early tech pioneers, they just think of countercultural hippies in garages.
Right, and that's the illusion. The Californian ideology was a deliberate, potent synthesis of 1960s bohemian aesthetics and radical anti-statist free market libertarianism.
So the free market aspect was always there?
The exclusionary, hyper-capitalist ethos was baked in from the very start. The architecture of the internet was explicitly designed to route around damage and central authority. And to these tech elites, taxation, labor laws, and the welfare state are perceived as damage to be routed around.
So you're saying the escape fantasies, the bunkers, the Mars colonies, aren't a deviation from the original spirit of the internet. They are its logical, teleological conclusion.
Precisely. And this is where the sci-fi aspect of the book becomes actively harmful. The book dedicates an enormous amount of page count to mocking the comedic absurdity of Mars colonies and brain uploading.
It does spend a lot of time on that.
It invites the reader to laugh at these billionaires playing out their Marvel superhero endgame. But that laughter is a fatal misdirection.
A misdirection from what exactly?
From the terrifying present-day reality. By focusing excessively on the distant, highly speculative silliness of futuristic sci-fi projects, the book blinds the reader to what is happening right now. Billionaires are not just sitting in green rooms waiting to hitch a ride to Mars in 50 years.
They're acting now.
They are actively utilizing the historically violent, colonial legal fiction of Terra Nullius, P-A-R-U-N-L-I-U-S today.
Just to clarify the term for our audience, Terra Nullius, B-A-G-R-U-K-X, is the legal concept historically used by empires to treat inhabited, ecologically sensitive lands as empty, unregulated spaces.
Yes, exactly.
It justifies pure capitalist acquisition and absolute sovereign control over a territory.
Spot on. And they are using their state-dwarfing capital to aggressively secede from the democratic social contract in the immediate present. They are building proprietary states, seasteading projects, and privatized municipal zones like Galt's Gulch, G-A-W-L-T-S-G-U-L-C-H in Chile.
How do those actually function legally?
Well, these are fully autonomous charter cities or special economic zones where private corporations act as a sovereign government. They are designed to legally bypass national taxes, democratic labor laws, and environmental regulations.
That's a massive shift in governance.
It is. I want to introduce a formalization from the critical literature that really grounds this threat. It's called the insulation coefficient.
What does that measure?
It's a conceptual metric measuring how effectively wealth is shielded from state redistribution. It factors in legal tax havens, private security forces, and these proprietary zones.
Okay.
As the geometric rate of wealth accumulation accelerates, these elites use their capital to push their insulation coefficient toward 1, meaning total absolute insulation. And as that happens, the minimal social contributions forced upon them by the democratic state approaches 0.
Meaning they contribute nothing back to society.
Nothing. The depletion of the public sphere accelerates toward mathematical ruin. That is the material reality.
That is a stark mechanism. It really is.
It's highly optimized and rational. It's not a psychological quirk. But because the book focuses on their childhood traumas and their silly Mars rockets, it completely misses the proprietary digital currencies and the charter cities. By making us laugh at the bunker, it distracts us from the offshore bank account and the privatized municipal zone.
I hear the weight of that structural argument, but I have to push back on the idea that the book is merely a distraction. You cannot separate the bunker from the charter city.
I think you can.
No, the psychology of the mindset is exactly what provides the internal justification for funding the charter city in the first place. Yes, the sci-fi escape plans are absurd, but exposing that absurdity is the narrative hook.
But does a hook matter if it leads nowhere?
It's what gets the general public to pay attention to the offshore accounts and the secessionist movements. You have to expose the pathology to fight the policy.
I understand that perspective, I really do. But the outcome suggests otherwise. When we look at all the structural evidence, the moral absolution, the epistemological caricature, and the sci-fi red herring, we uncover a reality where the book ultimately acts as a court jester.
I firmly reject the court jester label. That implies the critique is entirely toothless, which it isn't.
I argue it is. The author is continuously invited to highly exclusive elite events and paid exorbitant speaking fees precisely because his critique functions as harmless intellectual entertainment.
That's a pretty cynical read.
It allows the oligarchs to safely consume a sanitized psychological critique of their own fantasies without ever facing a genuine material threat to their entrenched interests. There are no rigorous demands here for wealth expropriation or antitrust dismantling.
I disagree that a book must outline a legislative antitrust strategy to be valuable. Exposing the psychological rot of the ruling class is a necessary prerequisite to public mobilization.
We'll have to see if that mobilization actually happens.
If people don't understand the bizarre logic driving the elite, they won't understand the need for structural reform. It's a spotlight, not a Jester.
Well, we will have to remain divided on its ultimate utility. My final observation based on this deep investigation is this. Laughter and localized mindfulness simply do not dismantle proprietary states.
They don't do it alone, no.
Hugging your neighbor does not stop the warming of the biosphere, and it certainly won't protect marginalized populations from the acute material violence perpetrated by the bunker class. Cathartic release only allows the powerless to feel intellectually superior while remaining materially subjugated.
And my final thought is that we cannot confront a material threat without first understanding the psychology that wields it. The billionaire in the desert, calculating the logistics of disciplinary collars, yes, he has the resources to manufacture them and the legal autonomy to enforce them in his privatized zone, like Galt's Gulch, G-A-W-T-S Gulch.
Right.
Seeing him as he truly is, driven by an isolating, pathological fear, strips away his invulnerability. It is up to us, the readers and the public, to take that psychological revelation and pair it with the structural action you're advocating for.
That's the hope.
We have to use rigorous analytical approaches, considering both the psychological mindset and the material reality to build our mental immunity against simple narratives. There's always more to explore beneath the surface. Thank you for joining us as we shatter these biases. Remember to subscribe to Cognitive Dose and keep questioning the narrative.